see your sticker today. Let me remind you of the events next week. On Tuesday, we have a lunchtime talk by Leo, who is here. We'll be talking about the definition of life, and we look forward to that talk. And I'm actually looking forward to the talk. On Friday, there is no lunchtime talk, but we have the annual lecture series at 3:30 p.m. It's online and not in person. So please, if you want to attend that lecture, go to the website and register to get a Zoom invitation. It will be given by Carol Lee, and it's going to be about racial bias in peer review, where she will be reporting some of our recent empirical work, I suspect. So I should be really interesting of work. Today, it's my great pleasure to introduce someone who does not need an introduction. In fact, because I've already introduced her a few months ago. But even for all of that.
But this time you have to get her name right.
Fair enough. I'm going twice. No matter of four.
Third time a charm.
She is an associate professor at Michigan State University, and as you all know, Heather works in issues related to science and values. She's very well known for her classic book. I think that's what I said last time, but I think I stick to it. Science Police. What's the exact title?
Such a classic.
I wrote it, but I told you it.
Science, policy, and the value
That's
free
what I
ideal.
thought.
Yeah.
Science, policy, and the value free ideal. And I want also to flag out her most recent book, which are the Descartes lectures, with commentaries after her own lectures, The Rightful Place of Science, Science, Values, and Democracy. She's working on a new book, which is probably make a splash because it's at the intersection of political philosophy and philosophy of science, which is such a great topic. It's really very timely, very important. So I'm really looking forward. And we've been very lucky to have her as a senior visiting fellow throughout the year. So, Heather, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Edouard, for that introduction. And what?
You mean Mashti.
Oh, no, let's not go there. Thank you all for coming on this beautiful day. It's very nice of you to be inside with me talking about these issues for a bit. In the fall, I gave a talk on rethinking the social contract for science, and I kind of mentioned public funding at the end, but I also kind of punted on it because it's really hard to think about, and I'm scared of it. And today I'm going to actually focus on it, despite my anxieties about talking about how to fund science. It is exactly, because of the political ramifications of public funding that we have to think about it, but that also makes it really tricky. Okay, so to just give a picture of where we are with science funding, this is a 2013 snapshot of science funding in the G20. You can see the blue is public government funding, the red is private funding. And it's been this way for 20 to 30 years that private funding outstrips public funding in most of the OECD countries. Russia is an exemption. I don't think we should use them as an ideal for much of anything these days. You can also see the percentage of the GDP that these countries are investing in. Most economists say at least 2.5% is sort of ideal for funding of these things. And the US is has been the largest funder of science just because it has a big GDP and does a big percentage of it compared to other countries. But China is closing fast. Okay, so that's the overall background picture of science funding. And in the US, we can see here a graph from 1953 to 2017. In the 50s, public funding did outstrip private funding, right? Cold War period. But in the 1980s, it flips, and industry funding has been pretty much outstripping public funding. So let's look, though, today at public funding. That's what I'm going to focus on because that's what political accountability is most important for. And here is a graph of US public funding for research. So DoD, NIH, this is sort of ascending order in size. The DoD is the largest portion, then the National Institute of Health, Department of Energy, NASA, NSF. So don't focus on the NSF, it's not a big player, amazingly enough. USDA, all other, and then a particular one-time funding. And you can see that despite, this is in constant 2020 dollars. So the general trend has been overall increasing over time. So whenever scientists say, oh, the budgets are being cut, probably not so much. So that's the fiscal backdrop of this talk. What I wanted today is talk about challenges with thinking about why we fund science and how to incorporate a sense of accountability. And I think there are sort of three things that really make this quite difficult. The first is that public funding has to be done in some sense on public goods because it's a public purse, it's public money, it's citizenry money. And so how do we build in accountability for a public purse, for a venture, where very often we don't know how it's going to go, which is the whole point of doing research. And this is against the idea that, you know, a lot of science doesn't work. Science is an enterprise that inherently involves failure and waste. And so we can't point to particular instances like, oh no, when a whole bunch of people were doing research on human cell lines in the 1970s and thought they were working on breast cancer cell lines or liver cancer cell lines, they're actually working on HeLa cells. So all their results were garbage. That happens. That's part of science. Or, you know, you think you have a good control, but it turns out you don't. You just haven't controlled for the right thing because no one quite knew what the right control was when the research program started. Or you have the wrong theoretical assumptions, like you're focused on genetic essentialism. You think genes are the end all be all. And then you forget to control for environmental factors, for example. Or you think bacteria just can't survive in the stomach. I mean, that's just obviously true. And so you don't discover that actually ulcers are caused by bacteria. Right. And so all the research on curing ulcers before this discovery went nowhere. Right. And that's just part of the scientific enterprise. Right. That's part of doing science. If we knew what the results were going to be before we did the research, we wouldn't need to do the research. Further, at least 10% of scientific publications are never cited across fields. So some people have like looked at this and there are varying numbers, but it's sort of robust across fields that at least 10% just don't really get any uptake. And this is without worrying about fabrication, falsification, questionable research practices. So there's just going to be a lot of stuff that happens in science that doesn't go anywhere. So given that, how should we think about publicly funded science? And which science should we actually fund? How do we make the decisions about the allocation of funding, given that this is the normal state of things? That's what I'm going to try to address today. And what I'm going to do is first talk about what we do now, talk about some central problems with what we do now, lay out a possible alternative set of funding models, which you guys can critique at will, because I'm just trying stuff out and draw some conclusions. Okay, so what we do now, back to this. We've already seen that the DoD dominates US funding. We spend about $160 billion a year on science funding, and about 65 of that is DoD. And then another 40 some billion is NIH and smaller amounts going up. Okay, this is, first of all, it's a lot of money, but we also see like the importance of mission focused things. You know, we worry about defense, we worry about health. Now, despite the mission focus of most of, you know, the four big funders are all mission focused. The pipeline model, this idea that if you just keep funding basic research and you just push hard enough, good things will happen. That still predominates the discussions around science funding. And this is the linear model for science funding, where you stuff the public funds in, pure basic science gets done. The best men do the best science. That was the 1940s ideal. And then that gets pushed out through a pipeline and does applied science and development or mission-oriented. And then you get consumer goods and medical breakthroughs and military security. That's what Vannevar Bush focused on, at least 1945. And Zeynep Pamuk has written a really lovely essay about how he didn't actually consult anyone on what the goods should be, which is kind of not very democratic of him. But it was, just coming out of World War II. Since then, there have been a lot of efforts to accelerate the pipeline. We keep saying the Bayh-Dole Act is a primary example of this, of just trying to get the movement from basic to applied to push harder. With the Bayh-Dole Act, for those who don't know, legalized patenting on the results of publicly funded research conducted at universities. There's a separate act that does it for national labs. And this established technology transfer offices at universities, which every university has one with patent lawyers working in it. Bayh-Dole Act, we'll talk a little bit about later, hasn't quite worked the way we wanted it to, but so then there's translational research in the 1990s, again, trying to accelerate that pipeline. Now there's HIBAR, highly integrated basic and responsive research, developed out of some consortium of universities in 2017, just trying to speed development, application, breakthrough knowledge to address society's pressing problems. So we just need to get faster at going from basic to applied to societal impact. And then we have the NSF Convergence Accelerator, which is also about sort of making all this happen faster. So all of these efforts for 40 years now, there are probably some in the 70s too. These are just a sampling, to try to move more quickly from basic to research to application to get societal benefit. So one thing that you might be asking about is, why are we attempting to accelerate before we know what the research results are? When we do this, we put all this money into basic research with the aim of accelerating to application without even waiting for the results of research to see, are they robust? Do they stand up to scrutiny? Did they pan out? Given the pervasive failure in science that actually happens. Now, there's also the mission-oriented research, and that you can sort of see is being conducted in two different ways. There's been a lot of research on the wonders of DARPA, the Department of Defense, and how effective they are at actually managing mission-oriented research, partly because they keep the scientists in check with the people who might want to use the research. So when a scientist starts going off into the weeds, getting interested in details that could never be relevant to an application, they get pulled back and refocused on what the actual point of the research is for the mission. We can compare that with the National Institutes of Health, which is very good at promising things. I mean, look at the National Cancer Institute, was founded to create the war on cancer, to cure cancer by 1976. That was the thing that it was going to do. And we keep seeing these attempts to sort of like fulfill a lot of promises. A lot of promises get made. Nothing really sort of ends up being fulfilled. And then you end up with a real big imbalance of NIH funding. So these are all the different institutes of the National Institute of Health. Cancer gets $6 billion a year. There's minorities and disparities in health funding. And yet we know this is actually where we could actually make gains in public health in the US. Okay. So I've actually, what we do now, but I've been talking a lot about the problems already. So let's talk about more problems. Clearly, it's really difficult to evaluate science funding systems, and that's partly because we don't actually do it. So Kitcher has this lovely quote in his 2001 book. Vannevar Bush had no detailed empirical studies of inquiry under different conditions of organization. Indeed, the necessary studies are still lacking. And 20 years later, we still don't have them. but this is not something that we've done. Most research evaluation of funding systems looks at best at internal metrics like publication citations, are you getting future grants, academic metrics, as opposed to are you actually doing anything that benefits society, which makes it really hard to justify those public funds, especially to the tune of 160 billion a year. Now, there is one really interesting project assessing impact that I found from 1967, so old. Project Hindsight was conducted by the Department of Defense to try to figure out what kind of science really helped the Department of Defense develop new weapon systems or improve weapon systems. So they're looking at weapon systems, and they're looking at weapon systems that they think have substantially improved since World War II. So they looked at 20 systems, and they looked at the previous 20 years of research, and they categorized all the events that led to the development of the improvement. This ended up being like 1,000 different events. And they categorized them in terms of undirected science, directed or applied science, and directed and applied for whom, and technology events. And they found some really unsettling patterns. I'm sorry, 710 events total. 0.3% were undirected science. 6.7% were directed applied science for DoD needs. 2% were commercial applied science, and 91% technology events. Now, you can just say like, okay, but these are weapon systems. We shouldn't be that surprised by this. They did, however, say, look, undirected science was really valuable for a lot of these things, but it's old undirected science. It's undirected science-based science that's like 50, at least 30, if not 50 years old. That's what made a difference in these things. So it's of immense value, but a much longer time scale. So the most helpful events were not from undirected or basic science. What was even more interesting to me was that it wasn't like it was orderly. It wasn't like it was like undirected science, applied science, technology. Instead, they found like technology, applied science, a bit of undirected science, a bit of applied science, some more technology. It was all jumbled up. There's no ordering among the kinds of events. It took a lot of time for scientific insights to be brought to bear. And it's usually in terms of decades. In particular, they argued that you needed to have time for the researchers in a field to really kind of coalesce around a result before it becomes useful outside of that field. As philosophers of science, none of this really should be super surprising. But we haven't really taken this on board for science policy. So underlying the pipeline model is this basic applied distinction. In previous talks, I've sort of focused on this, and I've realized it's kind of the red herring. There are problems with this distinction. Basic science, for example, was articulated also as pure science in the 1940s as a way to sort of keep science from having to worry about societal responsibility. It can't do that, but it still might be useful for funding mechanisms. More problematic is this sort of pipeline idea, this sequential building idea that you need to have basic research before you can have applied research. And that's just not true. We've seen that from Project Hindsight. We've also think in the past, I have now 3 different ways in which applied science produces fundamental discovery. You could have attention to countervailing phenomena like the noise from the microwave background radiation. You could have more detailed data that produces theoretical change. In Naomi Oreskes' book on Science on a Mission, she argues that this is exactly what happened to oceanography in the post-World War II context. Because they were looking for ways to hide submarines in the ocean, they actually discovered things about deep ocean circulation. So interesting. And then from John Norton's talk, I guess last month, about how something that is initially an application becomes an analogy and then leads to theoretical discovery. As in Sadie Carmel's thermodynamics. What about some of the major efforts acceleration? Let's look at the Bayh-Dole Act. It clearly increased patenting at universities between 1980 and 2000, although post-2000, most people say it kind of leveled off. So now there's sort of like an uptick and then a leveling off. But more than most tech transfer offices at universities actually lose money. So only like 16% make enough money to cover their own costs, which is not great. This is the venture. And there's a lot of people who are arguing that the benefit to both science and to the public is really unclear from all this patenting. There are people who accuse universities of doing exclusive licensing, which really kind of inhibits the use of various things. We don't have an effective research exemption anymore in this country since Duke. There was a Duke versus somebody court case from 2004, which eviscerated the research exemption for universities in this country. We've had increasing rates of patents for upstream research processes and products, which have been really constricted downstream things. And then the everyone's favorite patent trolls, right? And patent thickets. So it's really unclear that this has actually accelerated anything to produce public good. And then we have the problem of the peer review systems for things like NIH and NSF. A 10-year-old examination of NIH funding found, for example, that the most influential research in terms of citation, so like internal academic metrics, was not funded by the NIH. That the NIH, because reviewers disagreed, and there's a lot of research on peer review disagreement about funding, they ended up, peer review systems end up selecting the most mediocre research to fund, the least in the sort of, it's acceptable, it's okay, but it's not super influential, it doesn't push any boundaries. And then there's ongoing worries about the Matthew effect, that you just fund those who already have a lot of money, and biases, sexism, racism. I think Carol Lee will be talking about this next week. And then there's this lovely essay by Pierre Azoulay and company, Does Science Advance One Funeral at a Time? The answer is yes, that having someone who gets a lot of money to run labs, Matthew effect, when they die off, it harms their immediate collaborators, but it just redistributes the money throughout the research system in ways that actually improves the scientific work. Okay, so this is not a great system. It's not working well. And it creates this culture of over-promising, because in these grant proposals, like, if I find this, and if this follows through, and if then I will cure cancer. But it's rather tenuous, all the ifs that have to go in front of that. And this sort of continual over-promising is one of the ways that public trust gets eroded. I mean, why haven't we cured cancer yet? How long has this war on cancer been going on anyway? Now, biologists can tell us a lot about why curing cancer is way more complicated than we thought it was ever going to be. But these grant proposals and this public rhetoric around, we're just around the corner from the breakthrough. It's not helping things. Okay, how are we doing? Good time. And public accountability thus is still lacking for a lot of these systems. So the upshot of the problems, basically, I think the rationale for funding science is deeply confused by these conflicting conceptual structures. The pipeline model justifies a lot of things to try to push things through, and a lot of innovation and science funding ends up trying to accelerate things. The fact that we keep trying to reinvent the acceleration technique means it's not working. Mission orientation ends up being a very different kind of justification. And we end up wondering why fund basic research? What's going on if we don't have these systems? The current practices also ignore pervasive problems that we have with the funding system: conservatism, bias, overpromising, lack of accountability. So what I'm going to do in the remainder of the talk is argue that we need more complex and targeted models, structures, and evaluation systems for science funding. And we can't base it on just like a binary distinction between basic and implied, or even Stokes quadrant, where you'd only fund 3 out of the 4 anyway, because the 4th one is curio cabinets. Okay, so let's go through my alternative funding models and see if you are at all persuaded. I think we should have at least 6 different foci for research aims. Curiosity-based research, which we probably called basic research previously, but I want to get away from the idea that everything builds off of it. Public interest research, commercial interest research, military security research, regulatory research, and big science. For this model, no one foci generally builds or is temporally ordered after any other. There's no pipeline to accelerate. Just doesn't exist. There's no pushing that needs to happen. And I'm gonna, talk about these as different institutional systems, but they don't capture any particular discipline. So the epistemic focus of any particular area, like biology, all of them, physics, all of them, chemistry, all of them. Right, so you're still going to want to have your disciplinary societies, your disciplinary journals, and you want epistemic interaction among them. But the systems of evaluating proposals and measuring accountability for successive proposals are going to be different. Okay, so let's go through each one because we have the time. Curiosity-based research, I think this is what most academic researchers, including myself, currently do. All right, so this is, I totally think this is not, I don't claim to be doing anything other than this. For this, you focus on a question within your discipline or protect with among disciplines that drive your research, and you measure success in academic terms, like publication, academic recognition. Is the field move forward? That's the kind of thing that's looked at. I think we should generally end inflated promises for curiosity-based research. Don't talk about eventual societal impact, given that it is most likely going to be decades away, right? And quite difficult to trace. So that's not why we fund this. We fund it because we want to be knowledge-producing societies, because we are a curious species, because we care about knowing and understanding things about the world. That's why we fund this. You might be thinking, oh no, it's going to shrink the budgets. It might, right? The public has the right to pull back the purse on this, but it won't destroy science in the process. I think it's perfectly fine that for this research that actual public impact is never measured, because such measurement is fully outside the scope of the research. That's beside the point for curiosity-based research. And so you tie accountability to academic impact, which is where we are now. Publication, citations, uptake, avoiding fraud and questionable research practices. I also think that we should have a minimum responsibility floor of not making the world foreseeably worse. But I'm not going to talk about that anymore in this talk. That's a different topic, like how to actually build that into the institutions. All right. For curiosity-based research, I think one of the best models for funding is a modified lottery system. There's been a lot of publications on this, and people are actually trying them out. So New Zealand, Swiss National Science Foundation, a foundation coming out of Germany are increasingly looking at lottery systems to avoid the problems of Matthew effect, conservative bias, bias against women and researchers of color, and the burdensome, horrific practices of peer review when you have to get the panel together and they have to rank everything, which everyone thinks is the worst part of the system. Right? This gets rid of that. You do the external reviews, and then you set up a screen and you say, okay, suppose every proposal gets ranked 1 to 5. And you send it to 5 reviewers. Well, say you set a floor of like, you have to have a score of at least 15 to get into lottery. And everything goes into lottery. And after that, it's a luck of the draw. You can actually, it could do a lot for scientists because you can submit shorter proposals. You don't have to write about how you're going to save the world with your research. That's not the point, and is implausible in the short time scales we're talking about. You can actually go ahead and keep a proposal that doesn't get drawn in the lottery if you want to. And once it's past initial screening, you can say, like, for 3 years, it just stays in the lottery, and if it doesn't get drawn, you're out of luck, but maybe next year it will be drawn and you don't have to resubmit. There's no need to promise the tenuous societal benefits. And you could even, this is a fun little idea, just say if you have a registered report accepted, your methodology has been accepted by a good journal for registered reports, that there's just a lottery associated with that. Just goes right in. It's already passed the methodology is past peer review. And then you don't have to do a whole grant proposal separate from that. Okay. Then there's public interest research. Now, this, to be clear, is not just what the public is interested in. That's not what I mean by public interest. Right? It's not the cool thing about dog cognition and optical illusions or cool deep sea. That's not public interest science. This is when public interest is constituted when the impact of actions moves beyond those who decide to act. Then a public gets constituted and a public interest gets constituted. So this year around things we need to know, like what kind of pollution that people are putting out there actually harm us or pose harms to ecosystems. What kinds of public interests might be threatened by various sorts of private actions. What sorts of public goods need to have information about them to be governed. So initially, you might actually not have any members of the public interest. Broadly speaking, they might not know that there's a public interest at stake. But public interest research brings those things to light. Now, I think public interest research is possible different modes. You can do transdisciplinary research where you're working directly with non-academic partners to address problems, like community-based participatory research or participatory action research. You can do interdisciplinary research, working with interdisciplinary teams of academics to address public problems, and public interest detection that can just happen in your own particular research. So how should we fund this kind of work? Generally, first of all, I think it should be a bigger pot of money than the Curiosity-Based Research Lottery. Right? So this will change academic structures substantially. And that's partly because you don't have to have curiosity-based research done to do public interest research. In fact, public interest research can discover things that curiosity-based research should know about, like lead poisoning. Right? That actually has implications for all kinds of cognitive issues. And we should incentivize scientists to aim for actual public impacts, social impacts. I think for this kind of research, unlike curiosity-based research, you do need to have things tied to clearly articulated impact goals in measurable ways. And maybe we have a stronger preference for projects that are actually working with recruited partners to guide the project, to help evaluate whether or not it's actually going to be successful in helping the particular issue that it's aiming to help at, or whether or not the researcher has gone off on the weeds again and sort of ended up in details that have no possibility for having public impact. So there's no strictly disciplinary evaluation of this would make sense because it's very hard to think of strictly disciplinary public issues. Everything is mixed up in wicked problems, if you will, or just general social issues. And disciplinary development is not a goal. So you don't measure the impact of this kind of research on how well it's published, how well it's cited. You measure it about who the partners are and what they say about it, or what kind of impact it actually had on public goods. That's the appropriate measure. This is going to take a lot more experimentation than I've been able to lay out here. We don't tend to actually have good systems for public interest research funding at this point in time. Things tend to devolve back to academic metrics, unfortunately. And we don't support people to work through the complexities of actually working with external communities sufficiently in academia. So this again would change substantially some academic practices. I could imagine, for example, a pre-tenure researcher who does this kind of work, the publication record is not going to be the thing. It's going to be the evaluation of external partners on whether or not they're doing good work that actually helps. Okay, commercial interest research. This should not be a central area of public funding. Despite what people in Congress or Harper said in Canada 10 years ago. This is something that there's plenty of money for in commercial pots because you see that's already the predominant form of funding anyway. There might be some circumstances where we decide to put public money into particular projects to address particular crises. Right now, we were talking about putting public money into how to improve semiconductor chip manufacturing. Right, that's clearly a short-term project that maybe you actually say, oh, there's a public interest there in getting that done, or in pursuing COVID vaccines. But this is going to be an explicitly political decision that provides some public accountability for that. I think it should be very targeted and short-term. And so I'm really not for the large, like, let's have a program that attempts to foster these kinds of things. Military security research. I think there are really important lessons from Project Hindsight that we should take on board, and for how DARPA has been functioning really well to do research that is not just militarily beneficial, but actually really societally beneficial, which is kind of embarrassing for the rest of the system. That DARPA has been more successful than the NIH in funding some of the most important things like mRNA vaccines and breast cancer vaccines. That's not good, right, for the current system. I think the way in which it's done with mission-directed and overseeing research is really successful. It's very difficult to have public oversight because you have classified research very often. And that means that you're going to have to rely upon your elected representatives to actually oversee the budgets for this. That's not great, but that's what we got to work with, unfortunately. Okay. And then regulatory research is another area of deep public interest. But what I'm thinking about here is particular studies needed for regulatory processes, like the clinical trials needed for FDA approval, like the trials of safety for pesticides that go to the EPA. Currently, those are mostly privately funded and open to all kinds of creative methodological bending, which are well documented in like McGarrity and Wagner's book. If you want to read about all the ways you can bend science, wow, it's a whole book. It's super depressing. Torsten Wilholt has a classic example on Holman and Elliott's paper from 2018. Those are just some of the places that discuss how privately funded research gets bent. So if the funder is trying to get the study to say what they want it to say, there are all kinds of ways to make that happen in ways that can be quite difficult to see. So how do we fund regulatory research? Instead of having private entities fund the research directly, they would have to pay into, they wanted to get something through regulatory approval, they'd have to pay something like $500 million into an institute for clinical trials. That's the fee. And then that institute, which will be partly also publicly funded and run, will run the clinical trials. You won't have problems with file drawer problems and cherry picking of trials, all those sort of things that are currently happening. Only trials conducted by the institute would count regulatorily. So they could do other clinical trials if they wanted to, but it wouldn't matter for the FDA. This would end a lot of contract research organizations, but I don't think anyone would in philosophy of science would cry about that demise, given the rather damning condemnations of such organizations. And then big science. Okay, so big science is sort of an overlapping subset. There are lots of different aims, curiosity-based, think of Large Hadron Collider, public interest, think all of us, it's like a public interest, military security, there's a lot of different sorts of things that happen. I don't know of any regulatory big science, I have to admit. I don't think we've done that. Someone talked about having big science for chemical screening, but it just never got off the ground. Like 20 years ago, 30 years ago. These require big purses that generally require express political approval, like a budget line item, right? So that's supposed to provide some oversight. The problem with big science is right now, the people who advocate for them are the people, researchers, they have a deep conflict of interest because of course they want the big science project because that will continue their cultivation of postdocs, positions for their students, a whole line of inquiry that they are deeply invested in. So they have a conflict of interest. I have never heard of a big science community that wants to shut down the project. It's like, oh, we don't need this anymore. That just doesn't happen. And political approval is also deeply problematic. If you are a pro-science politician, saying no is difficult. If you're an anti-science politician, saying no is the knee-jerk reaction. So neither of those is particularly good. And then you have local beneficiaries who like where it's going to be built, and they also have a conflict of interest. And then finally, assessing the research agenda takes expertise. So how should we assess big science funding? These are big line items. As an example, take a look at debates about public funding for fusion energy. So right now, we have ITER in France. It's going to be very successful. It has not yet produced first plasma in a sustainable way, hoped for in 2025. But first plasma is not going to produce any usable energy, none, zero. The whole ITER project produces zero usable energy. It just produces heat and neutrons that we don't use. Okay, so how do we get from that, which Michael Clausen really loves, to something that actually is useful? Right now, scientists in the EU propose the demo project. They're saying that, you know, if they could potentially get the $20 billion of funding that it would take, they might have usable power by 2050. It's going to need tritium, so it's not going to be cheap. And the neutron flux produced in the reactor actually means that all of it turns into low to medium level nuclear reactor waste. Wait a second. This is not the clean, cheap energy just around the corner we were promised. And this book, these are both published by Springer, so it's super fun to actually read them together. You might be like, wait a minute, is that worth the $20 billion investment? Is that the right thing to do? Now, my first thought is, no, of course, this is a terrible idea. We could totally use that money elsewhere to actually do something that would actually decarbonize the planet sooner. But then again, I think I'm not the right person to make this call. Maybe this is finally the right place to use a science court. So science courts were proposed in the 1970s, deal with regulatory issues. But the problem is most regulatory issues aren't binary, like guilty, not guilty. They're like more complicated. So science courts for that purpose are kind of tricky. But for big science projects, you could have someone advocate for the project, someone critique the project. You could have a jury of peers of scientists drawn from the National Academy of Sciences who are not in the field, so they don't have a conflict of interest. Or even citizens, if you want to do a more democratic model, but you might be thinking, I don't know, I don't want to leave this up to citizens. Either way, it would be a public discussion, right? You could broadcast the science court arguments and put them on YouTube. And then you could have verdicts that tell you whether or not to keep the line item going or just devolve it back to a community-based research pool. All right, so I've given 6 different kinds of potential public funding research. Public interest research, I think, should be the major focus of public funding for reasons that it actually serves public interest. You're gonna need interdisciplinary evaluation teams with actual impact assessment. Curiosity-based research is still important, but maybe not as much money going to that. And you should use a lottery, and results should not be patentable. Get rid of the Bayh-Dole Act. Commercial interest research, only occasionally public funded. Military security research, major public funding, but you're going to really have to rely on elected officials for budgetary oversight. Regulatory research in a centralized funding institute to pursue that, and big science with a science board. All right, all of that, if you're like, oh no, my favorite project will get gored, don't forget, this is against the backdrop of much larger sources of funding, from commercial funding, philanthropy, and crowdsourcing. Those are all possibilities. Okay, and just-in-time conclusions. We need a more complex topography of scientific efforts. Different funding mechanisms are more apt for different kinds of projects. And that's not about discipline, that's about the aim of the research and how you're going to carry it out. I think different kinds of research should be evaluated differently. The kinds have little to do with disciplines, like biomedical research, end up in all 6. And there's going to be no temporal ordering among the kinds. We've got to get away from this idea that somehow basic comes before impact. That is not empirically true. And we still want to encourage, just because we have these different funding mechanisms doesn't mean we want to give up the epistemic interactions among all the different kinds. Right? So fields should still meet together, even if they're funded in different ways. That already happens now, but we have to make sure that that keeps happening in the future. In practice, got to get rid of the pipeline conceptualization. There's nothing to accelerate. That's just not what funding is about. We have to get rid of I think repealing the Bayh-Dole Act altogether. No great loss there, except for the patent lawyers. The aims should shape how we assess research proposals. Different aims should call for different mechanisms of assessment. And talking about, sort of meritocracy is not appropriate given the rather abysmal track record of meritocratic funding mechanisms thus far. So aims set the terms for accountability for public funds. Academic metrics for curiosity-based research, public impact for public interest research, commercial impact for commercial interest research, elected official assessment for military security research, reliability over time, checking for biases to make sure you haven't had regulatory capture of your institute for regulatory research, and the science court for big science. This is not going to be easy, right? I think this would make it better, but how to make it happen. So the first step is to do institutional experimentation. But I think that opens up opportunities for funding assessment. We could assess for different kinds of impacts targeted to aims across different institutional settings, funding research. And we may be able to assess what works better or worse over many projects. I think it's going to take that kind of quantitative data like Project Hindsight, but maybe with like a case-controlled research project going forward instead of just looking back. Because the anecdotes that we rely upon are really not evidentially robust enough, especially given that there will always be waste and failure in science. But current structures are entrenched and conservative, and the linear model accelerating the pipeline is still the default understanding of how to get from scientific insight to societal impact. I think tracking experiments and funding could help make the case for change. It's not going to be easy because it would be a profound change for academic institutions. If you think about the funding structures and the way they're embedded in our current academic structures. But it might actually do a lot for public trust in science generally. Thank you for your attention, and we will continue the conversation April 8th to 10th here at the Institutions in Scientific Research Agenda Workshop.
Break, and then you have plenty of time for questions.
I need to dry my mask a little bit. I have to vent it. It's so damp.
When I get to ask a question.
beautiful blanking page.
Of course.
Yeah.
My gaze immediately went to you, and you were already good to see you. Yeah, so it goes
So many
so
I was writing
Ted had a second procedure last week, except for the another $50,000 we could pay UPMC up front. So the Attorney General has taken up the case. Yeah.
And there's no way
They're not supposed to be doing this.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm like, okay, good, because I don't want to have to do it.
back to the point where I stopped talking and I was holding the bike and it was literally lifting the bike off the road.
Lunch outside, I'm teaching. I teach right up until the center talk, and always, it always comes over.
All right, so if you are online and if you want to ask a question to Heather, please go to the bottom of your screen, click on Q&A and write your name. And if everything goes well and we have enough time, we'll bring you in for a question. But we'll start with Sandy first.
Hi, Heather.
Hi, Sandy.
I guess I had two questions. So the first question has to do with this list of 6 different types of science. And I can see the first 4 all being really structured around the aims of the research. But the 5th and 6th don't seem to be aim structured. So they felt a little out of sync with the rest of the list. They're kind of orthogonal. You need a different way of, because as you say, you know, big science is about the cost of the research. It seemed that on your account, and that was what made it big, rather than the number of people doing it or other ways of measuring what makes it big. Or usually big science is also around big data. And so it wasn't, for me, those last 2 categories didn't really fit in the aim of science structure that you wanted to do. And I'm not sure I have a solution for that, because regulatory science is just doing different kinds of science on specific issues about application. So I guess I would suggest maybe think about that a little bit. But the other question was a little different about how to think about alternatives. And I understand your critique, and I think it seems I'm convinced about the linear model, but aren't you replacing it in a way by a series of other linear models? It seems to me there's other structures for allocation that aren't about should I fund this or should I fund that, but there's bet hedging structures about how much of my funding do I give to not sure they'll be successful, but if they are, there's a big impact compared to, oh, well, I know this is a sure bet, but it's going to inch me ahead a little bit. I mean, there's a lot of other kinds of ways to think about allocating funds rather than which one's going to, judging it in terms of which one's better on this list of things, including public goods. So given I applaud the increased complexity of the representation of the problem, but I think that the solutions might need a little bit more diversity in the way you think about funding, it not as a kind of choosing the top 5 on the same scale, but having the choices be differently structured.
Okay, so I'm going to try to repeat that for the audience.
Yeah, very shortly. So you don't get
So Sandy's wondering about types 5 and 6, regulatory research and big science, and whether or not they fit on the list of 6, and whether or not there are also other ways to go about making more complex the funding structures and moving away from the obviously inapt and inappropriate linear pipeline model. Right, okay. Okay, so I totally agree that big science is about a different kind of aim, because it actually, like I said, it sort of falls, it's sort of a subset of all of them. But because of the way in which the budgetary structures run for big science, I felt like I needed to say something about it, because it is different than sort of just funding NIH generally or funding NSF generally. Regulatory research, I think, does have a distinct aim, because there are particular standards of evidence that the regulatory structures are already calling for. And so the question is, how do you do those well and responsibly without trying to manipulate to get to the right answer? They are the answer that it meets your interests. And that's why in some ways we need a money laundering system to take, to clean the money of the commercial influence, so that the research is less likely to get bent, right? And that's what the Rice and Kitcher's Institute sort of is supposed to be doing. So producing reliable knowledge for the regulatory structures is sort of the distinctive aim of regulatory research. Now you might say like, no, I think it's something else, but we could talk about that. Whether or not there might be other ways to get at this, yes, there probably are. Whether or not you might want to have sort of, again, more complex pots of money and systems. But what I'm trying to do is just give an opening structure to get us out of thinking about accelerating pipelines to get to public impact. Because it's sort of, until you have alternatives on the table, like people keep sliding back into that way of thinking. I also don't think there's any such thing as a sure bet in research. I think that's a mistake. Right? But there's conservative and less conservative ways to do things. Okay, who's next?
Hi.
Hi.
Okay, as you know, I agree with you on a lot of this. And my question is, how philosophy research look like under your model? And I have like some ideas that I came up with. I can say them or start with just like, if you already have something in mind.
Okay, right. So philosophy research right now, like philosophy science is, I think, almost always funded by the NSF through the STS directorate. And I think a lottery would be much better than what they're doing now. Right. So I'm like for that. And if there are philosophers of science who want to work with external partners to try to figure things out in particular public interest, I would much prefer that there is a different pool of money to go to for that kind of work that is evaluated in terms of the impact on societal goods or the way in which the partner assesses the work. Now, you might be saying, look, that just seems to be replicating philanthropy funding. And that might be true, but right now the philanthropy system is so complicated and so much about developing personal relationships. I think it would be really good to have a publicly funded way to do this kind of work that's supported in this kind of way. So, I've had 2 NSF grants in my lifetime. I would have been happy for them to end up in a lottery. Outside of philosophy is National Endowments of Humanities. No, it has almost no money.
But like for philosophy generally, it's like outside of philosophy of
Yeah.
science. like the same.
Right.
But they don't get the money from the NSF.
No, and that would probably be also better to be lottery funding than whatever they're doing now, given what I've heard about the review practices.
I think I missed the answer to the first question from Sandy. And so that's my first question. Isn't big science, can't that also be public interest research, curiosity-based
Yes.
and military-based? And
Yes.
So why are you putting it in its own weird category? So that's the first question.
Okay.
Second question is a methodological question for you.
Uh-huh.
Why are you so comfortable in that armchair? Why didn't you go out and look at different examples of different funding structures? So for instance, the Riken Institute in Japan gives people 13 years of funding to do all kinds of research. And then they're forced to leave, of course, and join the real world, which is a harsh transition. But nevertheless, it's a different way
Yeah.
of funding science, and they think it's useful and good, and it's there's different institutes all over Japan.
So why
Um,
am I focused on the US?
Is there an implicit assumption that all funding mechanisms are linear and universal? I don't really. Why aren't there more examples of other kinds of funding models?
Okay, so Mike asked again, why did I talk about basic science as a distinct thing? And he also asked why
Makes sense.
big science. What did I say? and why didn't I look at other kinds of funding structures, especially outside the US, right? Like so let me answer the first question first. The reason I'm focused on the US is because I know exactly how hard cross-national science policy is and how difficult it is to get a fix on what the heck is happening in a different country. When I moved to Canada, I was like completely lost for 3 years as to what was going on. And you'd think, Canada, how different could it be? It's really different. And so cross-border science policy work is rare. And I don't know of anyone who's done sort of systematic comparisons. The best cross-border science policy work I know of is Shobita Parthasarath's Patent Politics, which compares the US and EU patent systems. But that's not about funding systems. And so I primarily focus on just the US because it's really hard to move beyond that, right? And that's why like the US funding, the data is all up from there. It's also really hard to get data out of, say, like other countries report data differently. Like I tried to get a similar kind of graph from the EU, and they were doing everything in terms of percentages and not in terms of like total euro amounts. And I couldn't figure out how to understand it. And that's just, again, one of those sort of cultural differences. I'm working now with the Joint Research Commission of Europe on various sorts of projects and hoping to get a different sense of how that's working there. Obviously, I need to look at Japan as well. So if anyone has like their favorite funding structure from someplace else, love to hear about it.
So the
But-
Gates Foundation actually aggregates funding data for certain causes and publishes reports.
Right, but those are going to be on certain causes, right? Yeah. Yeah, okay. Sources of information, right? So it's just really tricky. Now, big science, again, why did I put big science its own category? Given that I say like it crosses the different kinds of aims, because it requires its own usually line item budget, because it becomes a matter of political discourse in itself. I thought it deserved its own attention. And it has particularly thorny problems of who advocates for it, who decides, how decisions get made. Right now, it's pretty terrible how it's done. And so I was trying to think like is there a better way? Is there better, other than just having me say like, no, I don't think we should fund this. And I do think we should fund that. I mean, I listened to Sarah Green's talk about personalized medicine, and then I get calls from UPMC for all of us. And I'm thinking, what are we doing? What exactly are we doing? Who's evaluating these big projects? Nobody? Yeah. It's public money. So.
Yeah, good. I'm tempted to follow up on the big science bit. maybe we've said enough about that. Although it's interesting, I'm teaching this polar exploration course right now, and arguably the first big science project is the U.S. exploring expedition in the middle of the 19th century, which has a lot of these features about who's going to fund it and so on. It'd be fun to talk about that. But I actually want to come to the sort of alternative funding models and, you know, a little bit, press you a little bit more on the lottery. So there's, you know, what's the expected return on this lottery? We going to assume that only 20% of researchers will get something over their career, that the expectation is you'll get one such thing over your career. You know, it seems like those can have really different implications. Whereas if it seems like you know, you've got an 80% chance in every year, then, you know, you're going to get funded on expectation 8 out of 10 years. That's pretty good. Right?
Yeah.
But then the money is going to be a lot less.
Right.
And then sort of along those lines, I'm wondering what you think about these sorts of proposals that say, rather than a lottery, just allocate everybody an equal share, but tell them that they can keep half of it, but they have to give the other half away to other researchers, which they may designate as they wish. So the thought there is, if I've got, you know, let's say $100,000, I can keep $50,000 for my research. I've now got to decide how to allocate. And because I'm an expert in my field, I'm going to allocate it to, so it's a little bit of meritocracy. I'm going to allocate it though to those projects where I think they're going to be most useful for the kind of work that I'm interested in.
Yeah. Okay. So Collins asked about the lottery process and how that might work in practice and what expectations might be versus, say, a system where you give every researcher in the US, we have to talk about like who counts then. Is it, do they have to be tenured? Is it anyone with a PhD? Like what counts there?
The same shit for your lottery system.
No, the lottery, they have to put in a proposal and it has to be screened.
Can anybody put in a proposal?
Anybody can put a proposal and it has to be screened for minimum competency.
Okay.
And you can move the screen up and down. Right. And you can also, like some researchers said, oh, I'll just put in like 20 proposals in. No, like one proposal per PI, and you can be a COA PI and 2 additional proposals, and that's it.
So you could have a
Like,
similar screening for the reallocation process.
Right.
There's some pool of people that has been pre-approved.
The worry with the reallocation process is that it potentially would just replicate Matthew effects, right? The people who are most known, most prominent, they're going to tend to end up with the most additional resources, whether or not what they're doing is, you know, going forward is worth that. The thing that I like about the lottery is its flexibility in thinking about and the ways in which it could be tweaked over time to get certain outcomes. So like suppose you want 30% of the proposals to be funded, right? You can do that by raising the screen level, demanding like higher entrance of evaluation among the external reviewers for the screen. You could do that by lowering the amount per proposal that's allowed and say, no more, you don't get any more than $500,000. Like that's it. It doesn't matter like how much research you want to do. That's the max amount. Or you could do it by advocating for a larger pool, right? So there are sort of different ways. And then there's also issues of, you know, are you going to have lotteries where all the disciplines end up in the same pool, but each discipline runs its own screen? Or are you going to have allocations per discipline? Right? There's a lot of like tricky intricacies. And all of that can be played with to get to whatever sort of target you want. And I kind of like that system, because at least someone is looking at it going, you know, is this worth doing? Right? There is that, there's still some greatly flattened meritocracy going on. You have to get past the screen.
And that disciplinary, I mean, that's problematic. What's a discipline here? Physics, 20 disciplines or what?
Yeah, and I'd want to leave that in some way, the structure of the screening to the experts in the area, right?
We've got 10 more minutes and 4 people, so there's 5 to turn around.
Thank you. Thank you for the talk. So I like your classification of research, of course, aside from the big science part. everyone is tempted to say something else. But I have more specific issue. So you said that there should be more money put into the public interest research than to the curiosity-based interest. It sounds reasonable because public interest is what it is.
Yeah.
It's public interest. But I'm worried a bit that it can create incentives for people actually, whatever, like me, working in the curiosity-based camp, let's say, to frame their research in such a way that this will be more aligned with the public interest. So, for example, I can make my ontological research such important, I mean, in terms of the public interest, that, you know, and this can create actually a kind of mess, and it can disrupt actual decision making on both sides. So this is just my little worry. And when it comes to our favorite places, I would strongly recommend studying in the European Union, because we can have serious differences when it comes to what counts as public interest at different levels. So at the level of member states and at the level of the European Union as a whole, we can have huge differences. And research in energy production, for example, is a great example of agriculture as well.
Yeah.
So looking at it, it could be a really good case study. And that's
yeah, okay. So I think you're absolutely right to say it's sort of worrisome for me to say that public interest research should be greater than curiosity-based research. Honestly, I don't think we start there. I think, you know, I don't think there's the workforce to soak up $10 billion of public interest research money in the US right now. I don't think people are attuned to doing it. I think the communities that do this work are radically underfunded and also a much smaller percentage of this academic scientists in the country. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to actually say, yeah, NIH, your budget goes down to 20 billion and we're going to give 30 billion to public interest research right now. No, that would create exactly the kind of mess that you're suggesting. It would probably make more sense to set up the lottery institutions for curiosity-based research and you know, maybe fund them where the NIH is now, and you know, maybe even the NIH and the NSF together, and just say, like, this is all going to be lottery funding, and see how that goes, and put additional 10 billion towards public interest research, and then try to grow that sector. It's just that in itself will be a huge shift for a lot of universities, especially around medical funding. So that alone would be sort of like need like a 5 to 10 years to absorb. But it would be really nice if public interest research actually was the majority of the funding. That would be nice.
Thank you for such a fascinating talk. I'm really interested in your criticism of this intuitive pipeline model, whereby some basic, some research is basic, and only that spawns then applied research. Now, I was wondering whether you could unpack the evidence base for the criticism a bit further. So there were, in this talk, which was of course focusing on something else, you were briefly alluding to 2 strands of evidence. One was from history of science, how often applied, supposedly what we would classify as applied research, actually spawned or provided a basis for what we would then think of as basic research. So it's more of a two-way route. And you then pointed to the Hindsight project, which seemed to suggest that for applied research, far more events, as they termed it, from downstream research were relevant than from upstream research basic. And I'm wondering there, now, a very intuitive comeback on this.
Actually, that's not quite the right characterization.
All right.
What they found is,
finish the question so
Yeah,
you can see
okay.
what misunderstanding
Okay.
underlies it, then
Yeah.
you can fully correct the misunderstanding.
Okay.
Some intuitive comeback would then be, oh yes, surely just a few of these basic research events are far more impactful and relevant and far more enabling, etc., etc.,
Right.
etc.
Right.
And so could you just
Yeah.
expose the misunderstanding there and say why actually this not fully why that perhaps we are tending to attach too much weight to this basic research.
Yeah. Let me first say that there's a third source of evidence, and that is the attempts to accelerate the pipeline that keep getting reinvented and put forth as like a policy solution of some kind, despite lack of evidence of success. So there's a churn around solving this that people tend not to tout the successes of, oh, look at the wonderful things that the Bayh-Dole has done. Instead you find things like Bayh-Dole is a turd, to quote one essay I read recently on it, or the sort of problematic impacts of it, or translation research efforts. So there's the third strand there. But Project Hindsight, I think, is really interesting because what they found empirically was that the whole idea of upstream and downstream didn't make sense. That it was like more like this all over the place. And that in itself is really interesting because there wasn't stuff that like happened close. Sometimes it was technology, applied science, undirected science, technology, it just, the ordering, and they talk about that in the article, that some of that they weren't finding that sort of upstream, downstream there to be there. So we might call it upstream, downstream, but in like, I would love to see other studies where you actually systematically look at a set of particular results and be like, all right, let's go back and categorize all of them. Is there actually a stream? Right, that's something that we just haven't been doing. We've just been assuming it's working. Because I don't know why we've been assuming it's working. We have been. Yeah.
So I want to just question some of the presumptions a bit here, because some of the things you sort of said, here are the problems that need to be fixed and so on. Some of these have been pointed out for a while. It seems to me as though there's already been a bunch of steps, really particular steps to correct these things. So some, like the conservatism, the math effect, the disproportionate thing, all these things, at least from what I know in NSF, there have been things that we really even recently specific things that they're doing to correct it. So it seems like maybe it's not as broken as we were worried about, right? And that there's simpler things that can do to fix the things that really could be improved. So that would be one thing, that maybe we shouldn't be throwing out the whole baby here and just doing smaller things. So that's a general word that maybe you're asking, maybe you're pushing too far. But there is one thing you have that's pretty radical that I want to push on, just because this is one that stood out for me, which was the one of getting rid of curiosity-based research, getting rid of any judgment based upon social impact. We're going to push those over into public. Now, obviously, the broader impacts addition to funding was relatively new. That wasn't initially, and the whole idea of push was that this is going to be something where scientists determine themselves. We're not going to have that. And broader impacts became officially a thing, and it's now a big thing. To the degree that I think scientists are saying it's become too much of a big thing, but you're going to do away with that, right? And so that's something I think is kind of a radical shift. And I think there'd be some likely pushback from those who would say, no, that actually is something that differentiates between a whole bunch of really, really good proposals. We can only do a front step, but at least it gives us a way of picking them up. So it's good in that effect. Plus, it's for the taxpayer, right? It's your point.
Yes. Yeah.
Why would you do that, though? Pull it away. Plus, we're going to do a lot of things. So it's usually you're removing things that are judgment issues. And that's pretty bad. So that's what I just like to hear about.
Okay. So Rob asked, about why would I do a broader impact, and are things really broken at the NSF? I think things are really broken at the NSF from people I've talked to who have been on the panels and the way in which those panels have run. Should I talk about this openly? I guess I will. So for example, if you have a panel for STS and there's a philosopher of science on it, no philosophy of science proposals get selected by the end of the process. And the STS people go, wow, there's no philosophy of science proposals that have been selected because we all hate the philosopher of science. And so philosopher of science on the panel, pick your favorite, we'll fund that one. Oh shit, if that's what's going on, that's bad. I've also had colleagues submit proposals and get peer reviews back that are just garbage. Like literally, they did not read the proposal. And why is that having any weight? If you have a lottery system screening, if you get enough, very good excellence, the garbage reviews don't keep you out. So I think NSF has some really deep problems. I also think broader impacts has been a bit of a smokescreen since it was implemented. What counts as broader impacts for NSF includes everything from improving the diversity of your team, creating a new instrument that other scientists might use, to changing science communication, to communicating your results to a broader public. Notice that none of that is actually about the impact of your work on the public. So I think it's kind of bullshit and has been all along. Yes, I am. Because whatever. All right, so that's why I'm willing to be radical about that and be like, just stop with that. Now, I do think there needs to be some assessment of societal impact in the sense that you shouldn't allow proposals that are likely to make the world worse in through the screen. And so that should be part of the screening. But the whole promissory notes about what sort of impact it would have, or trying to find a way to reach a broader public with your work through a website. Why are we doing this? It doesn't make a lot of sense.
All right, I think there's a lot of questions that are open, but we should probably stop here. Thanks. Thank you.
Yes, totally broken.
Before